Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's topic, the political economy, and with a specific focus on inflation. To help unpack this topic today, I am joined by Joseph Grehan Bradley, a man who has studied ancient and modern history at the University of Oxford, followed by a master's at the University of Cambridge in political thought. Joseph currently works as a parliamentarian assistant at the House of Commons. Joseph Grehan Bradley, welcome to Finance Thinking.
Hello, James. It's really good to join you. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, and I couldn't think of a better person to explore this topic with, so we're going to get straight to it.
Perfect.
Okay, so as a public servant who has a deep understanding of the public conscience right now, what do you identify as the key issues that people of the UK are feeling?
Well, first of all, James, I have to say that you're flattering me by saying that I've got a deep understanding of the public conscience. I'll do my best to distill what I think are the key issues facing the people of the UK right now. And just before I do say that, I should say that though I work for a Labour MP at the House of Commons, disclaimer, nothing that I'm going to say is necessarily representative of the views of the Labour Party. I'm coming at this from a personal perspective, so I'll see what I can say. To answer your question, I think that overwhelmingly the main issue facing pretty much everyone in the UK right now is the cost of living crisis. And I think that when we talk about that crisis, we're talking about two things mainly. We're talking about inflation and steep rising prices, but we're also talking about pay, low pay, and the fact that pay hasn't really increased very much at all for a lot of people over the last 13 years. I think what makes the cost of living crisis so devastating at the moment is that it seems to be disproportionately affecting people who are already badly off or not earning much money, the working class in particular. I read a really interesting thread analysis of the cost of living crisis by food poverty campaigner Jack Monroe at the beginning of last year, where she noted that although the rates of inflation can be one thing, the price of basic goods and the rate of inflation for them can actually exceed the rate of inflation. And that has been borne out by what's happened over the last year. So the Consumer Price Index, which measures the rate of inflation, has found that between January and December 2022, on average, the rate of inflation was 10.5%. But for a lot of basic goods, the rate of inflation has in fact been drastically higher. So I've got a few statistics here to just cite just a few examples. The price of milk has risen by 39%. That's compared to the average of 10.5%. Cheese by 33%, butter 29%, bread 21%. So all the prices of those basic goods are outrunning the average price of inflation. And of course, for the working class, people who are relying on those basic goods to get by, they are being hurt even more by inflation and by the rising cost of prices. So that's one strand of the cost of living crisis. The other strand I mentioned was pay. All of these inflationary pressures are compounded by stagnant wages. Analysis has found that over the last 12 months, not 12 months, between 2020 and 2022, public sector pay has increased by 2.7%, whereas the price of goods has increased by 11.1%. So public sector pay is running 4 times lower than rising costs and the cost of living. And this isn't only just a phenomenon in the last few years. Since the Tory party took power in 2010, public sector workers had to endure many years of 1% pay rises, so below inflation pay rises that are essentially pay cuts, or pay freezes. And that affected so many professions: nurses, firefighters, teachers, you name it, people who essentially had to endure year after year of pay cut. And now that's really coming to a head in the current inflationary crisis we're facing. And that helps to explain why there are so many strikes, so much industrial action at the moment, that people are really feeling that their wages aren't able to support the sort of prices that they're seeing in the shops. So cost of living crisis is the main thing. Please do stop me if I'm running on. I think there are so many issues that I could talk about. But before we move to the next question, I do want to talk about another issue, which I think has cast a really long shadow over the last 13 years, and that's been austerity. The defining policy of the first Tory government from 2010 to 2015, led by David Cameron and George Osborne, the idea that in order to balance the books, public services had to be massively cut. And the systematic erosion of these public services is having dreadful consequences. for people at the moment. They aren't able to rely on public services to perform for them. We've seen this in the NHS, where waiting lists are out of control. I was talking to someone the other day who wanted to get a GP appointment in mid-January, and he was told that he wouldn't be able to get one until the 20th of February.
Wow.
Ambulance waiting times are over 90 minutes in most cases, which is terrible. But it's not only the NHS that is suffering. Schools are suffering as well. In the region that me and you are from, the Northeast, per pupil funding for pupils in the Northeast has fallen by 4.4% in the last 10 years, at a time when that money is needed most due to COVID and due to the lack of teeth that a lot of pupils were receiving during the pandemic. And as Keir Starmer noted in Prime Minister's questions a few weeks ago, the probation service has been gutted as well. And what that has culminated in is prisoners who should still be in jail, who shouldn't be allowed out, being out on the streets. And that causes tragedy. We saw it with Zara Alina, the lady that was murdered only a year ago by a prisoner that was wrongly identified as medium risk and was let out onto the streets. And within 9 days, he'd murdered an innocent young woman. So austerity is the root cause of all of these public services falling apart at the seams. And I think that the Tory government has to take a large share of the blame for that. Regional inequality as well is a massive issue, but I'm conscious of time, so we should probably move on to the next question.
So two things that you mentioned there was the CPI index, and the CPI index, consumer prices index, are used to measure inflation. However, the measure of inflation, as you mentioned, for the price of bread, butter, milk, all of the necessities of a UK household is well over that 10% measurement, the 10% rise in cost of goods compared to real wages, for example. It's very interesting to hear that that's the case, and the fact that the CPI is essentially not giving us a perfect reflection of what is really happening in the world has led lots of UK citizens to feel austerity at the root cause. Yeah. They've also felt quite anxious as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I'm able to tap into the political conscience. So as investors, as working class citizens who want to invest and want to be able to resist these economic conditions that have been thrown at us through the likes of the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, etc., it's important that we are able to prepare by learning from lessons of the past. And this is specifically where I'd like to hear about your expertise, as you've studied different parts of history in different depths as well, different time periods. So my first question, I guess, to lead on is, to what extent do you agree that history rhymes and that we can learn from ideas of the past?
Well, once again, James, I have to thank you for building me up so much and talking about my expertise. I can only disclaim that perhaps my answer is it wouldn't reach the level of certain history experts. But again, I'll give this a go. I think this is a really interesting question. And I have to apologize in advance if it's a bit of a fudge, because I think there are really strong arguments for and against this idea that history rhymes. But I'll give it a go. I think, first of all, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're trying to get at here is this big idea that people have that history can repeat itself, that there are very similar patterns that you can detect happening over time in different times, in different places, in different societies. And so I'll try and grapple with that question too. On the one hand, I agree that certain big historical themes are detectable in different societies and different places. You know, war, economic collapse, state building, revolution, all of these things you can see happening at different times and across the span of history. And it could be argued that the more you understand how those phenomena and those events have unfolded in different historical periods, the better you can understand them in the present moment. However, the argument that I would lean towards is that it's very difficult to learn from history a lot of the time. You can learn particular things and you can take particular nuggets of information, but this broad idea that history is first and foremost something to be learned from is something that I would contend with, and I'll explain why I think that. Most historians are quite cautious of the notion that history can repeat itself. Karl Marx, about 200 years ago, very famously said, history repeats itself, first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Most historians would reject that contention nowadays, primarily because different historical periods are, by their very nature, very, very different. That they're underpinned by different economic conditions, different people are living through them, and they're doing different things stimulated by different conditions. A really interesting historical trend that has emerged in quite recent times is the study of history in a day. And what that tries to emphasize is that just as important as long-term factors for determining historical events are very short-term contingent notions. So a historian called Colin Jones released a really interesting book called The Fall of Robespierre, which focused on one day in history, the day in which Robespierre, the French revolutionary leader, fell from power in 1793, and used that, just that day alone, to try and understand why he fell from power. And that's a really interesting assertion of the notion that contingency, almost random events, are as important in determining something that happens in history as long-term factors. And if you are to accept that, if you are to accept that the contingent is just as important as the long-term, then it becomes quite hard to argue that history repeats itself, because we can't use long-term factors all of the time to understand something. So a period of inflation is a long-term factor for determining a particular course of action.
Exactly.
But if you go.
So that's exactly what I would like to tap into. A history of periods of inflation, for example, the inflation that we're feeling now, which has been from the onset of essentially debt monetization following the COVID-19 pandemic, that didn't just happen in the UK, but happened in the US and lots of countries as well, to cope with the demands of COVID that they put on our lives. And comparing that to past inflationary periods that have been experienced, not to say that the history will exactly repeat itself. We know the conditions now are very different to, for example, the early 1920s. Specifically, we're going to focus on the German Weimar Republic and how inflation really got to grips with Germany and the effect that it had on everyday citizens like ourselves. So let's jump into that now. Let's jump into that now and look for parallels that we have between the modern day versus the 1920s. But for that to happen, I would like you to give us an idea of what were those key factors in the lead up to Germany's infamous hyperinflation in the 1920s. What can you set the scene for us, Joseph?
Absolutely, and I think you identify a really interesting historical period through which we can look at the key factors behind inflationary jumps and spirals. The hyperinflation, which we're talking about here, mainly hits the German economy quite hard in 1923. And in order to understand why hyperinflation takes hold, or took hold the way that it did, you need to trace historical events back to the Treaty of Versailles. And what the Treaty of Versailles was a very punitive document signed by Germany and the Allies at the end of World War I, which defined the terms of German surrender in the aftermath of World War I. That treaty had many different features. It confiscated a lot of German land. It put limits on the certain number of people that they could have in their military and the sort of weapons that they could use in the military. But I think the most interesting feature of the treaty, for the purposes of this podcast, is that it required payment of war reparations to restore the damaged economies of Western Europe, particularly the economies of Great Britain and France. And those, they just weren't any ordinary reparations. They were very, very high reparations. In 1921, they were worth £6.6 billion in British currency and about 132 billion marks in German currency. Any economy, even a very wealthy economy, would have struggled with paying those that level of reparations. But for the German economy, which was decimated by war in the same way that the other economies in Western Europe were, this was very problematic and caused a lot of problems in the years leading up to the hyperinflation crisis in 1923. It caused problems, first of all, because foreign providers of food and raw materials, who Germany were buying a lot of food and raw materials from, became less confident in Germany's ability to make those payments, because they were aware that they had to make reparations payments. And so if they were to accept payments in German marks, they required Germany to be paying over market value, over the value that those goods or raw materials would have cost in the economies which they were coming from. And so because Germany was spending more on goods, that meant that they were spending more money, and so the price of the German mark began to rise a little slowly in 1921. Another reason why inflation started to take hold in Germany was because part of the reparations deal, part of the reparations package, was that Germany was required to pay the Allies either in gold or in foreign currency. They couldn't pay their reparations in marks, in German currency. And essentially, Germany only had one option because the war had decimated their gold reserves. They'd used up a lot of their gold reserves to fund the war effort during World War One. And so they had to acquire vast amounts of foreign currency. The only way you could do that is by trading marks of foreign currency. And the only way that they could acquire a lot of marks was by printing a lot of marks. And as you will know, and as your listeners will know, printing a lot of money sets in train inflationary pressures and leads the value of the currency to decline over time. I'll just mention a third factor very quickly because I think that's the most important one. The first reparations payment for Germany was set at the end of 1922, and they defaulted on that payment. They didn't meet it. And so France, who was very insistent on being paid that, suggested that they would have to acquire the value of that payment through other means. And so at the beginning of 1923, French troops occupied the Ruhr in Germany, which then was the primary industrial heartlands of Germany, where a lot of goods were produced. And so because German businesses and German people no longer had access to the goods that they could sell, demand surged for a very limited number of goods. And when that happens, prices spiral. And so you get what ended up happening in 1923, where, for example, the price of a loaf of bread, which was 4 marks in 1921, was 163 marks in 1922. By the end of 1923, was 201 billion marks. People lit their fires using paper notes rather than newspapers because it was cheaper to do it, burning their fires with money. And if you wanted to go to a restaurant or buy a cup of coffee, it was very common for you to be given one price at the beginning of your meal and then be given another at the end because prices were rising so fast.
Wow. It's really interesting to have that insight into the 1920s. 3 parallels which I can almost bring from your 3 points are faith in the government. For example, the idea of the German Weimar Republic not being able to pay back their repayments caused a lot of debt monetization. And we can see in parallels in the UK today that in, for example, September 2020, when arguably a quite questionable monetary policy was used by government officials, that the price of government bonds and therefore the price of GBP currency, being essentially our version of cash, did plummet. And the idea of that happening with the mark was very similar, albeit for different reasons, in the 1920s. We've also got that idea of the population being unhappy, the idea of internal conflict, which helped perpetuate the situation, and in effect led to 2 different ideas. Today, we have a very polarized political landscape. We have the left, for example, and we also have the right, which seem to get more polar every year. And in the late 1920s, as we all know what happened after that, we had essentially the birth of Adolf Hitler and his political ideas, which was an idea of a more populist movement, which we have seen also in the UK and across our borders as well in the modern day. It's interesting that these parallels do exist. And for investors in the working class and people who want to navigate these tumultuous times, we want to understand how we can best navigate a crisis that hasn't happened, for example, in our lifetime before, but has happened in previous lifetimes, albeit with different people wearing different clothes to act out the parts. Okay. So, to emphasize that point, it can seem hectic for individuals nowadays to be going through an inflationary period, hitting, for example, the CPI of 10%. We know real terms inflation is higher than that, where in our lifetimes, as us being in our mid-20s, we have been used to almost, for the most part, very stable 2%, 3% idea of inflation, which has been a very consistent monetary policy.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to understand and draw parallels to for us is back into the 1920s. How did the individuals fare who were holding on to cash in the Weimar Republic? You outlined that the price of bread skyrocketed. You outlined that the idea in a restaurant that you would be given a different price from the start to the end of your meal, which is, it almost sounds farcical and bizarre. But can you give us an insight into how the German citizens were feeling as this was taking place in the 1920s?
Yeah, absolutely, James. That's a good question. I suppose my answer to this is a little more simple than the other answers. Individuals that were holding on to cash in the Weimar Republic during the period of hyperinflationary pressure, namely the working classes with limited amount of savings and the middle classes with a good amount of savings, both of them suffered terribly because the value of cash depreciated at an incredibly rapid rate. So even those who had considerable savings by any measure in the early 1920s, in 1921 or 1922, the value of those savings were wiped out, in some cases overnight. That figure I cited for the price of bread, 201 billion marks. Nobody had anywhere close to that amount of money, especially if you were working class or middle class, even if you had saved very conscientiously throughout your life. And so those who were holding cash saw the value of their savings wiped out very quickly. Those who had pensions also lost their pensions pretty much automatically as soon as hyperinflationary pressures set it properly. And so, yeah, it became very difficult for the working classes and the middle classes. A lot of middle class retirees had to return to work. And working classes had to try and utilize their collective bargaining power to renegotiate wages on a daily, sometimes even an hourly basis, to take payment in installments during the day, to rush back home at their lunch breaks, to give it to their wives or their children, and then to try and get goods before the wages that they had received on that day became worthless. And so a very difficult time for middle and working class people, people with cash savings in Weimar, Germany in 1923.
Okay. Yeah. So we know cash, although being a very turbulent economic time, lots of people feel very safe within the investment in cash, and therefore government bonds, which are essentially cash equivalents, they ended up with nothing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So let's turn the tables a little bit for investors and those who are thinking of being diversely invested to almost be able to navigate these times. What about those who were invested in German businesses? How did they fare?
That's a good question as well. I suppose that you might have some disagreement on this, and I think historians in general do disagree about this. The picture for investment in businesses is mixed, as I suppose it is throughout history. It very much depended on which businesses were being invested in, because different businesses were putting different economic practices in place during the period of hyperinflation. They were experimenting with different strategies to conserve the value of their businesses, and some succeeded, some didn't. For those who did succeed, the most prudent businesses, they capitalized on hyperinflation to try and ensure that the value of their businesses remained big and to reap big profits from hyperinflation. What these businesses would do was that they would refuse to pay wages on an hourly or a daily basis, to continue paying them on a weekly or a monthly basis, and thus be able to reap big profits from the fact that they continued with the business practices of pre-hyperinflation rather than post-hyperinflation. What Erna von Pustow noted, who was she wrote a memoir of her time in Germany during the interwar years.
Yeah.
And she was a keen observer of business practices. What she noted is that a lot of businesses as well would sell their goods at gold value prices, gold being a very stable commodity whose value remains high over time, even during periods of economic pressure and economic turbulence. They would sell their goods at gold value prices, but then pay their workers in paper marks, in currency that very quickly became worthless. And so we're able to reap big dividends from the difference between the two. So that's what a lot of businesses did. And what von Pustow noted, she said something along the lines of foreign commentators were telling her that everybody suffered from hyperinflation in Germany, but her contention was that wasn't true at all. certain people suffered and certain people won big. And some of the people who won big were big business, the types of people that would then go to bankroll the National Socialist Party and Adolf Hitler later in the 1920s and the 1930s. At the same time, conditions like the occupation of the Ruhr meant that some businesses didn't have access to the sort of raw materials that they needed to pump out their product. While that meant they could charge higher prices because of higher demand, it did cause some complications in terms of supply chains. So it wasn't a unitary picture, but in general, if you were investing in businesses, if you were investing in the right businesses, then you would reap rewards from the period of hyperinflation.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, despite such tumultuous economic conditions, businesses that are often trading across borders, as you mentioned, do need to denominate their value of their products, if you like, in a substance that is not prone to hyperinflation. As you mentioned, essentially pegging the value of their products to gold was a way in which they could maintain their profit margins, and therefore stakeholders in that business would be less affected, as opposed to essentially a salary worker who was receiving all of their money in cash, who was essentially slowly seeing their fortunes being evaporated by this hyperinflation. Okay, so you did mention businesses selling products, and especially as a post-war and almost a pre-World War II era, there was a higher focus on product sales, product businesses, as opposed to the more service industries which we have now. And those product industries need commodities. And commodities, well, you can tell me, what are the patterns of commodity prices during the 1920s? How did those that were, for example, holding 100 barrels of oil or had 1,000 chickens in the farm, how did they fare as the value of the mark kept decreasing?
But my argument would be, James, that those who held their investments in commodities were those who fared best as a result of hyperinflation. And some of them actually became richer during the period of hyperinflation, which seems absurd given what we've been discussing in the last 20-30 minutes. But I think a really good example of how people benefited from investing in commodities during hyperinflation is the case of the speculator and tycoon Hugo Stinnes, who by the end of hyperinflation was the richest man in Germany. Before 1923, as we were talking about earlier, when I was setting the scene of the post-Treaty of Versailles period, prices in Germany were rising, but they were rising at a slower rate to what they did in 1923. So someone like Stinnes, who was a keen observer of the economy, who was a businessman, who was a tycoon, saw that prices were rising, judged that they would continue to rise and that they would rise very quickly once Germany defaulted on their reparations payments, and so decided to exchange a lot of his cash savings. And because he was a wealthy man, he was the son of a businessman, he exchanged a lot of his cash savings for commodities, especially real estate and especially precious metals. And he not only exchanged his savings for those, he actually borrowed a lot of money on credit because he was so confident that investing in commodities would see him through the hyperinflation period and would see him richer at the end of it. And so it proved. Hyperinflation had two benefits for Stinnes, because first of all of the borrowing debts that he'd accrued became essentially worthless during 1923, even with high interest rates. And so he was able to pay off his debt very easily. But then he had very valuable assets that he could sell at the end of the period of hyperinflation. And as I said, sold them to the extent that he became the richest man in Germany. He died in 1924, actually, so didn't have much time to enjoy
the rewards.
but his record in 1923 was quite solid. And it wasn't just very wealthy people who benefited from investing in commodities. Even people who had quite a lot of debt, people who had borrowed a lot of money, were able to reap a lot of reward from the hyperinflationary period. They borrowed a lot, they invested it in even quite simple things like herds of cattle or chickens, like you were talking about. And then in the case of one individual, was able to sell one of his cows for the price that he bought the whole herd for, and was able to cover his debts just by selling one cow. So a crazy economic time, but some people were able to weather the storm for sure.
Yeah, certainly. And a few parallels which I've just been able to draw to the current period is, for example, the price of gold and commodities. Year on year, the price of gold has increased 8%, which is almost in line with the UK CPI rate of inflation, probably very close to the global rate of inflation if that was netted off as a global measure. Also, the prices of commodities in the current period of inflation have on average in an index increased by 20%. So what we're seeing here is very similar patterns between the 1920s, in which commodity prices increased as the value of cash also decreased. And we're almost seeing something which is very similar. Again, a rhyme, not a almost repeating pattern, but not necessarily with those same conditions. But those macro trends are very similar. You mentioned real estate and the idea of taking on debt before this hyperinflationary period. Well, lots of people who will have bought houses, for example, in 2019, will have had an interest rate of approximately 2 to 3% on a residential mortgage. You would be lucky to get a residential mortgage in the region of 4 to 5% at the moment, depending, of course, on your credit history. And therefore, the value of the debt that you've taken on and the value what you were paying back in real terms is a lot less as to what you would be paying back now. So yeah, we're completely seeing those parallels. Real estate, you did mention as well, as being an idea of another asset. Real estate, gold, commodities, they're all finite assets compared to the likes of cash and government bonds, which can essentially be created by governments through the process of debt monetization and various financial policies that are in place. We can see differences of who is faring better and worse in these circumstances. So, given the evidence that you've articulated, what would your opinion be on whether it would be good advice for young investors who are getting their skin in the game at the moment to spread their bets and diversify into different asset classes?
But once again, James, my answer here is relatively short and sweet. My advice would be that would be an excellent idea to spread your to spread your bets, to invest in different asset classes. As any keen watcher of your investment advice videos will know, you can't put all your eggs in one basket, because if you drop that basket, then all of the eggs break. And so it proves with, if you put all of your money and your investment into a particular asset class, and that asset class doesn't perform well, then you're going to be left out in the cold, so to speak. And so my advice would be, limited though my expertise in this area is, I'm more of a historian than a current observer of market trends like you. My advice would definitely be to spread your risk, to spread your bets, and to hopefully make money out of that.
Joseph, thank you very much for both your time and the insights you've given on today's podcast.
I really enjoyed it, James. It felt like I was speaking to the new Stephen Bartlett. I wish you every success in your podcasting journey.
Thank you very much, guys. And for the listeners who have come with us to the end, if you would like to see more content, please drop this video a like and subscribe, because we've got a lot more coming up. Thank you.